Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. The 20th century was in many ways shaped by America's unrivaled power. 2 decades into the new century, and it's clear the story arc is shifting. China is projecting its power across the globe. Russia is out to reassert its regional supremacy, and the limits of American power have been exposed from Iraq to Afghanistan. My guest is retired US General Ben Hodges, former commander of the US Army in Europe. Is America in danger of losing the race to define the 21st century? Ben Hodges in Frankfurt, Germany. Welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you, Stephen.
General Hodges, it's great to have you on the show. I want to begin not by talking about geopolitics or military balance, but about COVID and whether you believe for governments around the world the global pandemic has led to some sort of shift in priorities, a belief perhaps that some of the military threats they thought they perceived aren't actually necessarily the #1 priority right now.
Well, Stephen, I certainly think that some governments have done that, but clearly the Chinese government and the Russian government have been undeterred from their objectives by COVID, and same for Iran. So COVID is terrible. I had it myself. I mean, it's no fun, and no doubt people are suffering, but that doesn't change the fact that we still have to deal with the threats of the real world.
No, it doesn't change what you call the threats in the real world, but it does also change in a pragmatic sense the way governments see their priorities. Because I'm just thinking about the costs to the global economy of COVID-19, what it's done to Western economies, the US and Europe. We've seen recession, we've seen stagnation. And going forward, we see that governments are perhaps less inclined to spend what they projected to spend on defense. Particularly, that's true in Europe. Does that worry you?
Well, it does worry me a little bit, but I'm not without hope. I mean, Sweden recently announced a 40% increase in its own defense budget because of the threat that they see coming from the Russian Federation. So it's not automatic or mandated that governments won't invest in their own defense to protect their people from external threats as well as disease. I think we've learned a lot, actually, from this past year and a half about the importance of overall societal resilience as a part of security. And certainly in my country, in the United States, we've been exposed in terms of gaps in our healthcare system and an overall unhealthy society. So all of these things contribute to security, and our leaders, our elected officials, have to be able to take them all on.
Before we get to the specifics of what is happening in Europe today, particularly in terms of defense and relations with Russia, let's just talk a little bit about American leadership. You were the US Army's top general in Europe for about 4 years. You were at the sharp end of NATO's response to what Vladimir Putin was doing in Russia. And yet right now, the headline coming out of the United States is about retrenchment, is about looking inward rather than outward. And I most obviously see that in the symbolic commitment of Joe Biden to make good on Trump's promise to pull all US forces out of Afghanistan, and Biden says it will happen by September 11. In terms of US leadership, do you think that's a problem?
So, first of all, let's talk about US leadership, how important it is. We saw the last 4 years, the price we pay when the United States withdraws looks totally inward. And of course, America has always had a strong isolationist streak since our founding. But I'm happy that the new administration has stepped up and from day one has talked about the importance of American leadership and participation in NATO and the importance of allies. We clearly, even with the biggest defense budget in history, do not have the capacity to do everything around the globe that needs to be done to protect our interests and to protect our allies. Afghanistan President Biden's not making good on President Trump's promise. This is something that President Obama also wanted to do. Personally, for me, I'm relieved. There's a high degree of melancholy about it. I spent 15 months there under the command of General Sir Nick Carter when he was commander of Regional Command South in Kandahar. That was the hardest year I had in the Army. We invested a lot, but I think after 20 years, it is time to go. We all did our best to help Afghanistan. We accomplished the original purpose, and then we stayed about 19 years too long after that.
Well, I'm not sure you really did accomplish that original purpose, because I'm just looking at what Hillary Clinton said the other day. She said that actually one had to be honest and say that when the US forces do pull out by September, one possible outcome could be that the Afghan government will be toppled and the Taliban will take over. She said that there could be a resumption of civil war across the country, and at some point a largely Taliban-run government could take over. So I'm not quite sure what the $2 trillion the US has spent in Afghanistan has really achieved.
Well, keep in mind, the original purpose was to make sure that Afghanistan could not be the launching pad for terrorist attacks on the United States or the UK or other allies. That was accomplished in the first year.
With respect, we know that one branch of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, is still active with perhaps up to 2,000 personnel inside Afghanistan. We believe Al-Qaeda still has some remnants inside Afghanistan. So I'm not even sure how you can say that you're certain attacks won't be launched from Afghanistan in the future.
Well, of course I can't. My point is, Stephen, that after the first year, the main reason for going in there had been accomplished, and we should have left. We didn't. We did our best to help improve Afghanistan, to help improve their own security capabilities, because we also realized that once you do leave, the possibility of a return by Al-Qaeda or now ISIS was always a possibility. And so there is a decision that nations have to make. Do you maintain guards there, basically? I live here in Frankfurt, in Hessen, and the old Roman Limes Germanicus runs along the hills near here. For over 200 years, the Romans had soldiers up there protecting the Roman Empire. I don't think that's necessarily the approach for us. Having said that, we were not willing to do what was necessary. We, the coalition, were not willing to do what was necessary with regards to Pakistan to make sure that Pakistan could not be a safe haven for the Taliban or other extremist organizations. And if we're not willing to do that, then in 1,000 years, we're never going to completely eliminate the enemy from Afghanistan. And so I think it was time for us to leave.
I mentioned Afghanistan early in our conversation because I just think in some ways it's become a symbol of Europe seeing in the United States a weariness with a form of interventionism which, you know, has been long established from Washington, D.C. A sense of weariness, a retrenchment, perhaps a looking inward rather than outward. And if we are honest, during the Trump years in Washington, Europeans decided that they could no longer trust the United States to be the stable, permanent ally, which is why people like President Macron in France talked about NATO being in some ways defunct and how Europe needed to seek its own form of strategic autonomy. That's the reality today, isn't it? And Europe and the United States, never mind Joe Biden's presidency, Europe and the United States are not in lockstep as they used to be.
Certainly, I'm worried, but I would challenge your assertion that all of Europe no longer trusts the United States. Germany, France, maybe some other Western European countries, that might be the case. But I think the UK and the United States certainly still retain great trust and confidence in each other. And our allies in Central and Eastern Europe still have great confidence in the United States and, frankly, high expectations. But the burden is on us. The burden is on the United States to regain the trust and confidence of our German allies, of our French allies, recognizing that throughout the history of the alliance, there has always been friction. I mean, I was a lieutenant in Germany when there were hundreds of thousands of German protesters out on the street because of the deployment of Pershing II. And the French kicked NATO out of France back in the 60s. So it's never been a bed of roses, but it has been shared values. And so the burden is on the United States to regain that confidence. We need.
Yeah, but it's not happening. I last spoke to you in a field in Poland where you were wearing your general's uniform in 2016 as the U.S. Army commander in Europe. You were telling me how countries like Italy, Spain, Germany had to spend much more of their overall GDP on defense to be regarded as credible in Washington. Well, they're still not doing it. Spain is barely over 1% of GDP spent on defense. Now, Donald Trump's gone, Joe Biden's in office, but the message surely is still the same, that the US cannot convince Europe to spend what the US thinks Europe should spend on its own defense.
Well, you're right. It is unacceptable that several of our allies are nowhere near where they should be in terms of contributions to collective security, even though everybody benefits from this collective security, to include our great German allies right here where I live. I think that the last 4 years was a step back in many cases because the previous administration's approach was to publicly berate and to cast doubt on whether or not the United States was committed to NATO. I don't think that had a very positive effect overall. Certainly, it did not have an effect on Germany in a positive way. So President Biden has an opportunity coming up here on 14 June at the next NATO summit in Brussels in person to lay out his expectations. And I think that even though the style and the approach will be different, the pressure will be at least the same, that the president is going to tell our allies that we have got to work together and not make it about 2%, but make it about capability, about readiness, about carrying the load.
But again, I just think back to that conversation we had and you discussing with me how Vladimir Putin would look at NATO today. Let's update it to just a couple of months ago. Putin masses more than 100,000 military personnel on the border with Ukraine. How does NATO respond to that? Frankly, not with any great speed, alacrity, or assertiveness at all. If Vladimir Putin wanted to send those troops all the way to Kiev, he knows he could before NATO could get any sort of credible response together. It's not even clear NATO would feel a duty to respond because they don't want Ukraine to be a full member of NATO. This alliance that you think is so key to the future security of the US and Europe, it's dysfunctional.
No, come on, Stephen, that's not true at all. It's the most successful alliance in the history of the world. But of course, the problems that are there have always been there. It's the nature of a coalition. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. I wish it was, and hope it will be one day. Same for Georgia. But until the United States and Ukraine have worked out the bilateral relationship between us and our Ukrainian friends, and also once we have figured out what our strategy for dealing with the Kremlin is, we can't have any expectation that very reluctant nations like Germany and France would be willing to take on Ukraine as a member of the alliance. This is the first thing. We have got to get our own strategy straight. How are we going to deal with Russia? How do we figure out how to deal with them while maintaining a position of strength that holds them accountable? For sure, Berlin and Paris and London should be doing a lot more to hold the Kremlin accountable for its routine violations of international law, the killing of Ukrainian soldiers during a ceasefire that was put into place by Berlin and Paris and Moscow. I mean, this is the part that's so disheartening, is that our German, French, and even our British allies have done so little to hold the Kremlin accountable. President Biden laid out a policy statement in his first week saying that the sovereignty of Ukraine is a priority for the United States. So President Putin is going to test, okay, well, let's see how much of a priority it is. And so the burden's on us to develop the strategy for that.
Well, you keep saying the burden's on us. I'm not sure that you can bear the burden, because surely one other truth that President Putin sees is that right now in Washington, D.C., there is a conviction that the important strategic long-term threat, the rivalry that matters, the potential enemy of the future isn't Russia. At least that's not the number one priority. The number one priority is China. And the truth is the US no longer has the capacity to take on two geopolitical super rivals at the same time. And if they are now preoccupied with China, that means they have to, a certain extent, let go of their preoccupation with Europe.
I would put it in a different way. You're right. We don't have the capacity to do it alone, to deter the Kremlin, to contain the Chinese Communist Party, and also, by the way, contain Iran, worry about North Korea, and protect the global commons. You're right. And that's why the president correctly stated the importance of alliances in his speech at his inauguration back in January. If we ever needed a strong European pillar, it's now. And so I think the administration is going to work very hard, is working very hard with our allies, particularly in London, Berlin, Paris, but also in others. You saw just yesterday he was participating in the so-called B9 conference with all the heads of state from the Bucharest Nine, Central and Eastern Europe, because we need Europe to be able to deter the Kremlin without a lot of U.S. Participation.
But if I may say so, Europe shows no sign of following America's lead in key ways. I'm thinking, for example, of economics. For example, the German government is not, it seems, willing to abandon its Nord Stream 2 shared pipeline project with Russia. Mrs. Merkel has been committed to that and won't let go of it. At the same time, if one switches to Beijing, Italy, for example, is already signed up to play a role as a partner in the Belt and Road project. That is China's hugely important strategic effort to project power through economics. So Europe isn't buying into America's assessment of these threats.
Well, again, I would disagree with your characterization or generalization that putting all of Europe in the same box. You're right about Germany. I'm very disappointed that Berlin has put commercial ideas or priorities, particularly with Russia, but also with the Chinese Communist Party, ahead of everything else. Germany right now, of course, has elections coming up in September. They're looking almost completely inward. It's going to be a very interesting next several months to see what the next German government looks like. The Biden administration obviously will work closely with our German ally. The EU is the largest trading partner for the United States. So even if not one country paid £1, euro, krona, or whatever for its own defense, it's to America's economic interests that Europe is strong, prosperous, and secure. So we're never going to turn our back on Europe. And also, frankly, all of our best and most reliable allies come from Europe, as well as Canada and Australia. So this is part of great power competition. The United States and our allies have got to figure out how to compete in the diplomatic sphere and the economic sphere, not just in the military sphere.
Yeah, I mean, you've just co-authored this book, Future War and the Defense of Europe, and you're making a case for Europe and the US working ever more closely together to face looming strategic threats. But in the course of this conversation, I'm thinking to myself that the US and Europe are simply not on the same page in so many different ways when it comes to the assessment both of what's going on in Russia and, perhaps more importantly, what's going on in Beijing.
Well, I think you're probably partially right there, and that's why, we have a new president. The last president caused a lot of damage, I think, with relationships with our most important allies. And so the new administration recognizes this, that even though the domestic focus and priorities are significant, naturally, as they are in most countries, and we do have a long-term challenge from the Chinese Communist Party, the administration knows that all of our best and most reliable allies are in Europe. And so we're going to have to figure out how to work with the European Union, for example, as a partner, not as the enemy, as the previous administration described them, working with our British allies, working with other countries in Europe that are so important to holding the Kremlin accountable and competing. I think the administration has to compete, not threaten sanctions against all of our most important allies. We have to come up with a better source of energy, better 5G network, not just threatening our friends.
We're running close to time, so I just specifically now want to talk about China, because you have said not so long ago that you thought there was a very strong likelihood that the US would be at war with China within 15 years. Do you feel that right now?
Stephen, I have to tell you, I was wrong. I think it's more like 5 years, not 15. And I base that on a couple of things. Number one, the Chinese Communist Party, the language that comes from Beijing, very, very harsh, militaristic about Taiwan. They see that the West, including UK, did almost zero in response to Hong Kong protesters being smashed and shut down. They continue their efforts in the South China Sea. So I think that the possibility of a kinetic conflict, I'm talking about planes, submarines, missiles, ships, actual kinetic conflict happening between the United States and China in the next 5 years is very real. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong, but the United States, working closely with allies in the Indo-Pacific region, such as Australia, South Korea, Japan, but also with India, increasingly important. And then, of course, the Royal Navy and the French Navy helping in the Pacific. And this is very important.
In a sense, I associate you with, tank warfare and running the US Army in Europe and all of that. But actually, what you seem to be saying in the book and elsewhere is that when it comes to assessing the risk, the threat coming from China, you have to think about cyber warfare. You have to think about economics as warfare. You have to think about artificial intelligence. My question to you is, you're a veteran of the Army over 40 years, but do you think the US military today has the strength to withstand those sorts of 21st century threats coming from not just China, but Russia as well?
Well, we were reminded in America yesterday, over the last 2 days, of our vulnerability to cyber attack when one of the largest gas pipelines in America was shut down by a criminal gang, DarkSide. So that vulnerability is right in our face, and of course we've got to prepare for that. And if we ever do get in a conflict with China and or Russia, this will be a part of it. But also, we can't be too quick to say, hey, look, tanks are over, it's all about cyber now. I mean, what was it that had everybody all nervous over the last month? It was the sight of hundreds of Russian armored vehicles and Russian ships, very conventional capabilities that were part of it, part of their demonstration of power and their attempts to get leverage over the government of President Zelensky. It's conventional power as well as the use of disinformation, cyber, and all the other tools that they use. So we have to be able to operate in that full spectrum.
Do you think the United States today has the capacity and the will to win the wars that you appear to believe it is going to have to fight if it's to shape the 21st century as it did the 20th?
Yeah, only if we have allies.
And this conversation suggests to me you're very worried that the allies are not as staunch as they need to be.
I would say that there are some that are completely reliable and can be counted on. There are some that are falling well short.
And if they continue to fall short, you are then surely by implication saying the United States' position in the world is vulnerable.
Yeah, of course. We're being challenged all the time. This is about great power competition. Now, I do believe great power competition prevents great power conflict. So if we can compete with allies against the Chinese Communist Party, against the Kremlin in terms of diplomacy, information, and economy, not just military, then I think we have a chance to prevent that conflict from ever happening.
We have to end there. General Ben Hodges, it's been a pleasure to have you on Hard Talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for the privilege, Stephen.